Shashi Deshpande is an extraordinary figure whose writing spans more than a quarter of a century, a very consistent writer of fiction in many genres. Born and brought up in Harvard, where she went to school. She later, actually, her first degree was in economics, something she decided she hated the minute she'd won a gold medal. And then, more interestingly, her second degree was in law. She actually practiced for a year and then decided that she hated that as well. She then took a third course, a diploma actually, in journalism, and went to work for a magazine in Bombay. So her education was spread across the cities of Harvard, Bangalore, and Bombay. She worked as a journalist and thought that was the worst of all. But was it better than was it better than law or economics?
Better than economics, certainly. Yeah.
I think the main point about Shashi is that she's a completely self-taught writer. I'm amused all the time, eavesdropping at lunch today among young people who talk about Iowa Writers Workshop, this school, that school, courses in creative writing. The main point about Shashi Deshpande is that she grew up in a very, very literary household. Her father was a distinguished Kannada playwright and biographer, memoir writer. Was that the impulse because you were overeducated in a sense for your time and yet you rejected your education?
I think I was very clear about what I didn't want to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I sort of did all those things, realized they're not for me. My early love was reading, but I never thought of becoming a writer. People ask me, when did you decide to become a writer? You don't decide to become a writer, you just start writing. And the minute that happened to me, the minute I started writing, I knew this is it. This is my work, this is my life. So it was extremely simple in a way for me. The decision was taken out of my hands.
Yes and no, because as I've just said, you also grew up in a deeply literary household. That wasn't it,
Absolutely, absolutely. Because my father was very known and he had a lot of literary friends. And our house was full of writers and literary talk and books. And I knew the life. But I never thought that it was for me.
Your first novel came out, Roots and Shadows, in the early 80s. But two novels that came out almost within a year. Where did this creative impulse? Because, you know, people don't sit down one day and say, okay, now I'm going to write a novel. It's a process. And it's often a dormant process. How did this expression suddenly gel after a series of conflicting, or shall I say, abortive experiments in other careers?
And I didn't go to a novel straight away. I started with short stories. I wrote a lot of short stories and I was very lucky that I had them all published. You know, they were published in News Weekly, Femina, Illustrated Weekly, Junior Statesman, plenty of magazines in those days which took short stories, the Deccan Herald. And I think that publication is a very important part of writing. I did not write and put things in my drawer and imagine myself a genius. I published them, and when you read your published work, I think you get a proper sense of what you are, what kind of a writer you are. So there was this desire to, you know, it was people who interested me. And I found that the short story did not give me enough time to delve into people's lives. I wanted to go deeper into people's lives, and therefore I think I thought I'm going to write a novel. The thing had come to me, the idea. But it took me a very long time to find the, you know, the way of structuring a novel. I used to write 3,000 words and then stop because that was a short story length. So it took me quite some time. But the desire to write a novel, to explore people's lives more, to explore people's minds. I think I knew from the beginning that it was people who interested me and it was people I was writing about. So I wrote without any clue to publishers. I didn't know there are publishers. I didn't know who are the publishers. Somebody told me because after I wrote The Dark Horse No Terrors, and I just sent it off, and I thought, I mean, I don't know what I thought, and within a week, I got a letter saying it'll take a long time, or 2 or 3 months before we. And in a few days, I got a letter saying I just started looking at your novel in my lunchtime, and I couldn't put it down. So we are taking it, and we're going to send you a contract. That was one of the best moments of my life, I think.
Right. Mind you, you're also talking about a time, the 1980s, when avenues for publication were very limited as compared to today. I mean, there was a handful of publishers, they paid badly, they printed books badly, they treated authors shabbily for very, very small sums of money compared to the kind of glamour and money and competition and manuscript auctions that we hear about today. It was a life of double hardship in a way.
Well, that was what one accepted, and I have to say that some of these things still continue. It's only a few writers who are getting the cream, most writers still have to deal with publishers who are not interested, publishers who give you very little money. Nobody ever thought of writing for money, not to earn a living. My husband was supporting me, I had a house to live in, I had 2 meals a day, I was not in any way money, and my dad told me, I don't think you'll ever earn money through writing. You can earn enough for 2 cups of tea and a cigarette, which was what he wanted.
And I'll tell you what your remarkable husband, one of Bangalore's leading pathologists, told me. He said, Shashi, I'm going to stop teaching pathology and I'm going to start a clinic so that you can write.
Yes. He offered me that, yes.
So very supportive family.
Yeah, but I told him no. I said I can earn my own money. No, it's true. I had a huge support. I think that's all one needs. Moral support as well. That, there was no feedback from anyone for my writing. It was like throwing a stone in the ocean. There he was telling me, keep going, keep going, keep going. Not a literary man at all. Without that, I could have gone on. And my father also read my manuscript of The Dark Horse No Terrors. I could see that he was impressed. He never said it. We didn't have that kind of a relationship. But it mattered a lot to me that he, read it and gave it back to me and boasted about me to somebody else. That was the generation which didn't tell it.
Well, that's a very touching story because, of course, the great model of women writing, the most famous essay, the seminal essay is Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own.
Yeah.
That's all a person needs, particularly somebody as unsupported and possibly vulnerable as a woman.
Yeah.
But here's the difference, that both your father and your husband supported you morally, materially,
financially, yes.
and intellectually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is unusual.
But I think I had to do on my own. The rejections, the heartache of rejections I had to deal with on my own. The problems of dealing with publishers I had to deal with on my own. And that caused me a lot of problems. Yeah.
Right. But you touched very briefly about the trigger or the spark of the creative imagination when you said that you had become so accustomed to writing short stories which by definition have a limited form. You can't do an extended long short story because then it becomes a novella. And that structuring a novel and character studies is what took you a very long time.
I think the structuring of the novel took me a long time. Like, for instance, that long silence. I rewrote the first few 50 pages at least a dozen times because I was not happy with the way it was. Suddenly it occurred to me that it has to be the voice of the woman, entirely her voice. And that's how it became. It was a monologue. I mean, she is thinking, and there's nothing in that novel but the woman thinking of her life. And after I wrote it, I said, my God, nobody's going to take this novel. Here is this woman sitting at home and thinking about her life. Well, I'm happy to say it was proved wrong. I sold it to Virago. A friend of my father's told me, sell it abroad. And I knew I could not go to anyone but a feminist publisher because the stuff was entirely suited to a feminist publisher. And they were very thrilled. So that was what gave me my break.
Women's voices and a feminist viewpoint. So in a way, in the 80s, you are ahead of your time before the feminist debate becomes public and the personal really becomes political, which is the underlying dictum of feminism. I'm curious to know, why are all your novels, almost without exception, dominated by women in all age groups? In fact, men have almost a marginal role. They are, I would reckon, more the cause of sorrow than of liberation. And as your fiction becomes more and more dense, women across generations are in conflict with one another. The past weighs heavily. The plots are triggered off by tragedy, often death of boys.
This idea that I write, the question, why do I write about women, is something I always need to reject. Because you can't write only about women. Men are part of the world, children are part of the world. But mainly the point of view is that of a woman, I would say. And of course, I go deeper into the woman's psyche because these are the people I know best. And lastly, I can tell you this.
What about the corruption of Anna Karenina, or indeed of Charulata? Now that you mentioned Tagore and Tolstoy, who have portrayed very strong women, and many people think that there must be a kind of undeniable root to them, that they got into the female psyche. But I would argue that both Anna Karenina and Charulata are extraordinary portraits and studies.
They are indeed, but then how many of them? How many writers like that?
You're saying they're the exception
they are
rather than the norm.
exceptions. Tagore is a rare person in Indian literature to write about women. Generally women as a subject, it is always...
the male gaze, is that what the phrase you're looking for? The male gaze?
Absolutely. Today morning we were listening to a session here where writing was spoken of in terms of wooing a woman or kissing a woman. And that is so entirely male an idea. And these are the things which always sort of made me angry. And I thought, this is their point of view, but there has to be another point of view. I think part of the reason for my beginning to write about women was to, give this women's point of view in the sense of showing what women are, bringing myself, and not my own self, but myself as a woman into the literature. I heard a West Indies, young writer from the West Indies say, I began to write novels because none of the novels had me in them. It was always the white heroine. So she said I had to write about a black heroine. So in the same way, like, George Eliot wrote about or had to write about a not good-looking woman. In the same way, I think I did feel that absence in literature. And not that I was trying to correct it. I was just saying something which I wanted to say.
Particularly in Indians writing in English, the literature of your time. I guess there would have been contemporaries of yours who were quite prolific. Anita Desai, principally writing about women, Nara Sehgal. And from another point of view, frankly, Ruth Chadwala, suddenly out of fashion, but hugely in fashion and controversial. She was principally writing about India and principally writing about female relationships often. So it's not that you were alone, but what's interesting about your fiction, Deshpande, is that not only is it women-centric, but there are women in conflict, often generations of women. I want to first ask you, why are your protagonists so frequently in conflict with parents, particularly mothers?
I think every female will sort of agree with this, that, mothers have a certain idea about how daughters should grow up. And it comes out of their own lives. And obviously daughters have their own ideas about how to live. I think more strictures are laid on daughters than on sons. So I think it's inevitable that there should be a conflict. There's no... it's not very unusual. It's part of life. That one generation is in conflict with the previous one, and every parent will say, wait until you have a daughter or a son, and you will know what I'm trying to do for you. So I think these are all part of life. And
there are women who are breaking away from this, breaking away from the strictures placed on them not just by their families, but especially their mothers.
Very much so, very much so. I think that is absolutely very clear.
You know, Small Remedies, for example, which I think is one of your finest novels, is to do with two women who both take extraordinary decisions in their time. One becomes in pursuit of classical music, runs off with...
She's a Brahmin woman.
Exactly, upper caste, who runs away with a Muslim Dabachi, elopes with a lover. Mind you, this is material of musical folklore, possibly based on several. The other joins the Communist Party. And so the contrast of these women taking life in their own hands is then extended to a third female human.
That's right, correct. And that's where the structure thing comes in. How am I going to tell this story? Like I said at Aurora's launch, the main point about writing a novel is it's a story about people, and it can be told in many ways. So for me, the main problem is how am I going to tell this story? So Small Remedies, many times you can't go into things directly, like for the Dark Holds No Terror, there's such anger in it. There's such power in that anger that I could not write it. It was likely to become melodramatic, maudlin, emotional. So I had to cut down on the emotion. I had to bring it lower down. And therefore, I had some things in the past, something in the present. Memories in the past where she is very angry and her emotions are very rampant. And the present. So to here, I had these two women. I have a third woman who brought their stories together.
In a later generation.
Yes.
And using the literary conceit of the niece coming back to write the biography of the classical musician and her controversial elopement.
Absolutely. But it was not her elopement which was really the problem. It was her dedication to music, her desire to pursue a career, her, the way she achieved her goal, and how ruthless she had to be in the process. I think that was of great interest to me, the ruthlessness with which she had to, because she couldn't have done it otherwise.
Whereas the gentle, quiet girl becomes the passionate revolutionary.
Leela,
Leela becomes the trade unionist and party leader in Bombay.
And she too marries a Catholic. She marries a Roman Catholic. So, she too goes a Brahmin woman marrying a Roman Catholic. So they completely, go out of what is laid down for them, the rules laid down for them. So for me, it was important to show the women of a younger generation. I thought of the older generation. I thought this book was my tribute to the women of a much older generation. And of the extraordinary things they did, which we, very little.
They too rebelled.
They too rebelled, and they
broke the mold.
Absolutely, and I think they did the kind of things which, the courage of which we can only see when we contrast it to the times they lived in. The kind of rules that were set for women. I mean, the way women had to live their lives within very narrow walls and, within certain sets of rules. And in spite of that, they moved out. To me, that was extraordinary courage. So this book, for me, fulfilled that idea of mine of, women, courage of women.
Right, but the past impinges upon your fiction heavily. We were talking about this with your childhood friend and co-writer Maria Aurora Couto the other day. The past is predominantly weighs in her non-fiction, and it was fascinating for me to see both of you in discussion with the distinction between fiction and non-fiction, given that the material or some of the characters, whether real life or created, are very similar, and their crises are similar. You said that maybe fiction writers mask reality.
No.
Or wear masks.
Wear masks, I said, that's right. I mean, in the sense that when you are writing fiction, like Aurora was writing her story, and it was she herself, she was confronting the world that this is my story. Whereas when I write a story, I don't have to say that. It's just me writing a novel. They are fictional characters, and I can sort of distance myself from them. And I think that's the real thing about the novel, that the author is never writing about oneself. I mean, a lot of people seem to think that you write your own story. If you've written 10 novels, you should have had 10 lives in that case to write, which you don't. So you're writing something thing which comes out of you. You're taking people whom you never sort of know. They're not real people. Nobody takes real people. And maybe it's the combination of various things which comes together. And then you transform them in your imagination. You cannot take people as they are. But Maria had to take people and show them. The courage was in showing what they really were. And for me,
not just as character studies, but they're very accurately observed and indeed researched social milieu.
Absolutely correct. But for me, the social milieu is also, I need to work at it, because if I'm writing about the 19th century or so on, but that cannot obtrude. It has to stay under the surface like one part of the iceberg. What comes above is the fiction, and what remains below is the reality, and it does not obtrude, and you don't have to read my book and think, oh, she's done good research. If you do that, my novel is a failure.
Yes, because a novel is not an alchemist.
Absolutely. So, the research will never show. Nevertheless, one does go deeply into, how did people live then? What were the ways of living? There's such a lot of things one needs to work on. But it should not show. To me, that is the very important thing about fiction.
Yes, well, the great axiom for brilliant fiction is that, in fact, it's show, don't tell.
Yeah.
That everything is in the suggestion,
absolutely.
in the telling detail.
Yeah, and how you tell.
You show it.
You don't talk about it.
Voltaire said, if you want to bore a reader, you tell him everything.
Absolutely. This should be more suggestion than, the actual telling.
A leitmotif that recurs again and again in your fiction is death, particularly the death of the young.
Yeah.
Why does that recur, and why is it such a flashpoint in these women's lives?
I think death is one of the most life-changing events for most of us. I mean, birth and death are the two, events which are really out of our hands. And birth is most often a happy event, but rarely is it a, dreadful event. But death changes our lives forever. I mean, anybody who
Especially the death of the young.
The death of the young is, yes, absolutely. But even the death of a parent, even that, when you know that they're going to die before you, I've seen people so traumatized that, their personalities change. Because their personalities or who they are keeps us in the place where we are. Once they are gone, it's like the ground shifts under your feet. So I think death is really the most life-changing event of all, not success.
Rather like the Lok Sabha speaker's bell. I've already had one warning, so let's quicken our pace because I'm trying to ask you many questions. Your literary journey has traversed a very wide terrain. Apart from consistently producing fiction, up to 12 novels in 25 or 30 years, you've been amazingly prolific with several collections of short stories, generally 3 volumes or 4 volumes, essays.
Yeah.
How do you switch from one genre to another? What does it take?
It's like you switch off and switch on. A novel you can never switch on, but there are times when it flags. Like I've come for a holiday, when I go back, I can't immediately go back into my fiction writing. So maybe I write something for a paper which has asked me to write. Short stories I've stopped writing. Unfortunately, I cannot write short stories.
You've done
a lot of, I've done about 90 short stories. And collected. And of course, children's books also I wrote when my children were small, no longer. So that's
right. Quick last question.
Yeah, sure.
Quick last question. How has women's fiction changed in a radically altered or changing place and role and social norms for women generally in our world?
The fiction has to change. It has changed. Women's writing has really changed. There was a era when all of us, were sort of Pratibha, etc., we were all of us writing the same kind of feminist fiction, whether it was Indian language, it was English. But now I think we've all sort of moved on, at least I know that I have moved on. I can no longer write the same way I did. And I do resent it very much, let me say this loudly here before I'm thrown out of here, that I get very upset when people talk about me writing about suffering women. I never write about suffering women, for God's sake. I write about intelligent, thinking women. That to me is the main characteristic of those women. They're not suffering, they're not victims. Because you can't, I mean, nowadays, I know in the media you don't call a person a victim, I think they call them survivors. And maybe that was the idea I had in my head, that you can't call women victims. So I think I've written about survivors, and survivors are coming out of it all now. And I think I'm very glad to see what's happening in the country today.
How will your fiction change?
It's already changed. It's already changed, and the next novel, I'm sure it will change even more. So.
Shashi Deshpande, what a pleasure to meet you. And the best conversations I've ever had out of women or writers like her. Please give her a big hand.